share. Here we go. So, like I said, we're in the book of Hebrews, chapter 5, and it's been a good month or more since we were able to get together and study this. So I'm just going to briefly review the beginning of the chapter, and starting with verse 1, as soon as my slide advances. There we go. So in Hebrews chapter 5, it says, "For every high priest taken among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he might offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was." And so this is a transition actually from the last chapter. Chapter 4 ends with, we have such a great high priest who is tempted and tried in all parts as we are, and comes into this chapter and it says, "For every high priest is taken from among men, is appointed for men and pertaining things to God." That's what a high priest does. A high priest is for, if you go back to Leviticus, you go back to Exodus and the books of the law, you find that Aaron was appointed as a high priest so that he could take care of the temple. He was in charge of all the stuff in the temple, and he was in charge of the Kohathites and the Merarites, and I can't remember the lastites, but he was in charge of all those people, and they took care of the temple. And he himself had one job. It's like that joke says, you have one job. And that's what he really did have, really one job, and that was to go into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement and to offer a sacrifice for sins for the people. But before he did that, like it says in verse 3, it says, "Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so himself to offer sacrifice for sins." The high priest was a sinful man just like you and I are. And because of that, because he sinned, he had to take, I believe it was a bullock. He had to take a bull and sacrifice it so that he could have forgiveness of his sins before he went into the Holy of Holies and took the blood of the lamb into the innermost part of the temple, or the tabernacle, and put it on the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. And so he had to for himself offer sacrifice for sins as well as the people. That was his main job. That was the job of the high priest. And so that's also the job of Jesus. But the difference is that Jesus didn't have to sacrifice for his own sins. And so because of this, it says, and so in verse 4, it says, "No man takes this honor for himself, to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was." And you can go back and look at Leviticus 16. That's where the Day of Atonement's talked about. Or Leviticus chapter 28, verse 1 says, "Now take Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister to me as priest, Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar." And so in Numbers chapter 18, verse 7, it says, "Therefore you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything at the altar and behind the veil, and you shall serve. I give your priesthood to you as a gift of service." And again, that's an important thing too, because that's what the high priest is. He's a servant. We often think about, especially as portrayed in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that the high priest was a lord. He was the one who was in charge, and he had his own guards, and he had the temple guards, and he had his own. He headed up the council, and so you see him more as a lord in the New Testament. But really, the high priest is a servant. And he's a servant to God, but he's also serving the people by being an intercessor between them and God, by taking that sacrifice in. So verses 1 through 4, that's what they're talking about there. They're talking about a high priest who is called by God. And this is important because as we follow through in this next section, we're going to talk about how Jesus was called by God. So let me get to where I am in my notes. That's the next slide. So he says it starting in verse 5. He says, "So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest." If you went back to that last slide, it says that the high priest is called by God. the high priest didn't appoint himself. He didn't come to the people and say, I'm going to be high priest. The people didn't come to him and say, you're going to be high priest. Instead, God said, Aaron, you're going to be high priest. And he did the same thing with Jesus Christ. It says, so also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he, God, who said to him, Jesus, you are my son, today I have begotten you. As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, this first part here, we talked about this a little bit last week, that Jesus didn't glorify himself. In fact, at one point he says in John chapter 5, verse 31, he says, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. In other words, he didn't toot his own horn. He didn't say, hey, look at me. I'm the greatest. I'm the one that God chose and all that. He allowed God to do that for him. And really, we can do the same thing, right? And we should do the same thing. Let God glorify him. Let God glorify us for it, instead of us doing it ourselves. I'm sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied there. Oh, William Spahn has his hand up. Let me go over there and unmute William. Let's see, can I do that? Can I do that from here? I don't think I can. No. Okay. Scott, can you unmute Bill?
I think I'm unmuted. Am I?
You're unmuted now.
Okay. Yeah, quick question there about verse 2, where it says of the high priest who can bear gently with the ignorant and erring,
Yep.
for he himself also is compassed with infirmity. At least it says that in my version.
Yeah,
Is
because you've got an antiquated version.
Yeah, is that similar to when Jesus says he's tempted in all points except without sin? So is that what he's saying there? Is basically he has the same infirmity we do, the high priest does. And of course Jesus didn't have the infirmity, but he was compassed around with all the temptations that we were, except he didn't sin. So it sounds similar to that.
Right. That's why I brought in that last section of chapter 4. If you go back and says Jesus was tempted and tried on all parts. We have such a great high priest as he is, because he was tempted just as we are, but he was, you're right, without that infirmity. He didn't give in to the temptation. So you're exactly right. It's the same type of thing. And the priest, just as Jesus can have compassion on us, which is what the end of chapter 4 says, he can have compassion on us because he went through the same thing as we did. The priest also should have compassion on those who are that way. In other words, they shouldn't think that they're in a class by themselves above others because they're so holy, because they're men just like we are, just like the Jews were, is what the author's saying here. And they should make sure that that they have compassion on those who are going astray. Gotcha?
Got it.
Okay. Unraise your hand so I'm not distracted by it. Okay, where were we at? We were here. In John chapter 5, verse 31, he says, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. And then he goes on to give 4 witnesses. The first is John, and he says, but he doesn't need the witness of a man. And then he goes on and says that the miracles he does, the Father bears witness, and the scriptures bear witness. It's called the fourfold witnesses. And of course, the Father did glorify Jesus in a number of situations. When he was baptized, he said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. On the Mount of Transfiguration, when Peter said, let us build a tabernacle for Jesus and for Elijah and for Moses, God came back and said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Hear you him. So God actually glorified Jesus in a number of situations. In John chapter 17, in verse 1 through 5, he says, I'm just going to read this one verse, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. And so we have this glorification going on here by God of Jesus. And so it says he did not glorify himself to become high priest. Jesus didn't ask to become high priest. God made him high priest. And he goes to Psalm 2, and I think that's what I have next on my screen. Psalm 2, we're not going to read all of this because we went through this, but he says in verse 7, it says, I will declare the decree, the Lord has said to me, you are my Son, today I've begotten you. And then it says, where is it? Did I not have the whole screen? It also says in there somewhere that he's going to be, oh no, I'm sorry, that's in Psalm 110. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And down at the end in verse 4, it says, the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest according forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And we're going to get a little bit more into Melchizedek tonight. And let me find out where I am in my notes. Just make sure that I've got that. Of course, the point of these couple of verses here is that Jesus, did not glorify himself, but God did the glorifying. He not only called him his son, but he calls him a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And so we're going to have a bit more to say about what this actually means, and we're going to add a little bit to it as the author does. Right now, this is the third mention of Melchizedek in Scripture. It's only the third mention. And of course, the Jews have a lot of beliefs about who Melchizedek was, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. But unfortunately, the most we're going to get out of this when we want to really talk about Melchizedek is in chapter 7. The most information that we have about this person is not in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, it's in this very book. So the first mention, of course, is in Genesis chapter 14, the second's in Psalm 110, and the third and the fourth ones are right here because he's going to say it twice. He's going to say it in this verse, in verse 6, and verse 10 also. And so but like I said, the author is going to save their real explanation about Melchizedek in chapter 7. So we're not going to say a whole lot about it here. Chapter 6 has a reference, but chapter 7 has 6 references to Melchizedek. And so I think it's a fun exercise sometimes to go out on the internet and see. You can just go Google, who is Melchizedek? And you may be surprised at some of the things that you read about this guy, because there's a whole folklore regarding him. There's some stuff that came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were not scriptural, some apocryphal stuff that has stuff to say about him. But let's go through and see we already looked at Psalm 110. Let's go look at Genesis chapter 14 for a minute. We're going to be in verses 18 through 20. But the Jewish reader should have known who Melchizedek was. In Genesis 14, if you remember, Lot is living in Sodom, and a group of kings come down and they raid Sodom, they raid Gomorrah, they raid the cities of the plain, and Lot gets carried off by these kings and his wives and his daughters and all of his stuff, and they get carried off, as well as all the people of Sodom and Abraham. You'll see, and if you go back and read Genesis 14, Abraham gathers up his friends from Mamre, that's right. Can't remember the name of the actual guy, I didn't look it up. But he has a couple of good friends there, and they gather a troop together. It says Abraham has over 380 men of his own house that are armed, and they go out and they rescue Lot, and they defeat the kings, and they're on their way back to meet with the king of Sodom. And then in chapter 14, it says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. And so this is the first real mention. It's the first mention of Melchizedek. We don't know anything about him. Later on, we're going to see that it says that he has neither father nor mother. Let's see, I've got someone on chat over here. Let me see what's going on, if that's for me or not. I think that's, oh, thank you. Eshcol and Aner were Abraham's friends. Mike says, thank you for telling me that. I didn't look it up, I apologize. It wasn't really as important. I should have thought about it. And what else is going on? Okay, so, and he gave him a tithe of all. So this is the first one. While this is an interesting little interlude, it doesn't really tell us anything about Melchizedek except that he's king of Salem. He brought bread and wine out to Abraham, and he blessed him. And then Abraham turned around and gave him a tithe. And so That's basically it. He, like I said, he accepts a tithe from Abraham. Now the Hebrew's not clear as to who tithes to whom. In English, we would look at that and we would say the preposition and antecedent and all of that. That's still not really that clear. But how do we know? Well, I can't really ask. I guess you could respond. But how do we know that it was Abraham who gave Melchizedek the tithe? Because the book of Hebrews is going to tell us that. So we've actually got the sum of God's word is truth, and we know for sure that while even though the Hebrew here is ambiguous, the book of Hebrews is not ambiguous on it. And he's going to make a big point of this, in fact, that Abraham tithed and Levi tithed through Abraham. We'll see that later. There are some who suggest that Melchizedek gave the tithe to Abraham, but that really doesn't make any sense in the context here. So again, chapter 7. So Genesis chapter 14 and the somewhat cryptic prophecy in Hebrew or Psalm 110 are all the scriptures that we have. Now there's some extra biblical stuff about Melchizedek, and we're not going to talk about all of that. Like I said, if you Google who is Melchizedek, you're going to find a lot of interesting theories. One of those is that the Jews believe that Melchizedek is actually Shem, the son of Noah. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's kind of weird. And I've pointed this out before, but when Shem got off the boat, he didn't just die. He lived for 600 years. In fact, it's possible, I'm putting a graphic up here. It's possible that Shem actually outlived Abram. And it depends upon whether in Hebrews chapter 11, it says in verse 26, it says, not Hebrews, Genesis chapter 11, verse 26, it says that Abram was born 75 years after Terah was born. But there's another verse in there that suggests that maybe it was a little bit longer. Depending upon which one of those verses you go to and how you reconcile that, Shem outlived Abraham by a number of years, and you can see that on the chart there. You've got, and I don't think I can use a pointer here. Oh, I can use my mouse. So you got Shem right here, and he comes almost out to this line, and Abram doesn't. So Shem actually either outlived Abraham or died very close to the same time. Now, is there any proof that Shem is Melchizedek? Absolutely none. It's just kind of an interesting thing out there that they think that the Jews think that. They've got another thing out there about how Shem blessed Abram before he blessed God, and so therefore the priesthood was taken from Shem and given to Abram. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. So it's pure speculation and stuff, but you're going to run into stuff like that. But I thought it was kind of interesting that they thought it was Shem, and of course it could have been. It's quite possible that that Abram knew Shem, which would have been pretty interesting. Firsthand knowledge of the flood from a guy who went through it. What we do know, though, is that this is the first mention of someone who's called a priest of God. His original name in the Hebrew is actually two words. The first part meaning Melech, meaning king, and the second part Sedek, meaning righteousness. And again, later on in the book of Hebrews, it's going to call him King of Righteousness. He's also King of Salem. Why is he King of Salem? Because that's where he lived. Salem is the forerunner city, the name before Jerusalem. It's the same city. It was just changed because of the Jebusites, I guess. So he is the King of Salem, the King of Jerusalem. So those are the things that we do know about him. Again, most of the stuff we really know about him is in the book of Hebrews. So it says, who in the days of his flesh, when he'd offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears, to him was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And being perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. So we've got these two verses here at the beginning, in verse 5 and verse 6. Again, it's not the first time he's used the quote from Psalm 2. It is the first time he's used the quote from Psalm 6, or I'm sorry, Psalm 110 in verse 6. And he's again telling us that he's starting the long explanation to say that Jesus is better than the Jewish high priest, because he's actually going to be both priest and king. And that's one of the things that Melchizedek was. He was a priest and he was a king. And so that's what Jesus is. That's why Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek. That's the long and short of it, is because he's both priest and king. So it says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him, was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his godly fear. In the days of his flesh. Of course, that means that, Mike Franklin's got his hand raised. Scott, can you unmute Mike? I don't think I can do it. Let's see if I can do it. Oh, I can. Oh, you've got your hand, you're unmuted, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if you would comment on, okay, I'm sorry. Just a second here. I was just wondering if you might make a comment on, or what you think it means when it says, today have I begotten you, speaking to Christ, what that refers to. Have you looked into that?
I would, but if you go back to the earlier version of the earlier time, I think it was in Hebrews chapter 2, when we talked about this before,
Okay.
It either refers to his birth or it refers to his resurrection. And I am about split 50-50 on it, although there's quite a bit of evidence that it's talking about his resurrection. If you go back and look at the study where we mentioned this before, we went into that quite a bit. And rather than go back and dig in my notes, I'll let you go back and look if that's a good enough answer. But it has to do either with his birth, because he's the only begotten Son of God, or it has to do with his death or his resurrection, because that's another, I can't remember the exact scripture that says it. But
That'd be Acts 13.
Yeah.
And I forget the exact verse, but I
Me
recall
too.
that being.
So if you're interested, in Mike's question, you can go look at Acts 13. But I could go either way on it. But certainly Acts 13, if that's the right reference, suggests a link between this idea of being begotten and resurrected.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Yep. Okay. In the days of his flesh. This, of course, is speaking about when the word became flesh. John 1:1, John 1:14. In John 1:14, it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is talking about Jesus as a man. And it's going to make clear that it's in the days of his flesh when he was a man, because of what's going to follow here. Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, we've talked about this before. Philippians chapter 2, verse 8 says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. So again, these two verses are talking about what we're talking here about, this idea of suffering and but being in the flesh. Again, the Gnostics believed that Jesus wasn't an actual fleshly being. They believed that he was an apparition. And John was writing against that. But we see that here, that Jesus had a body just like you and I did. And he was a man just like you and I were. So it's in those days. This also points to something that I think is interesting, because there's more of his life. We use a similar phrase, in the days of his youth, he did this or that. When he was a young man, he did this or that. That implies that he's no longer a young man. In the days of his flesh kind of implies the same thing, that he's no longer in the days of his flesh. And so we see that here, that this is only a portion of his life. If you remember Scott Sousa's illustration of the rope, and he brought this long rope out and unrolled it on the stage, and like an inch of it was colored a different color. And he said, this is our life on earth. And his illustration was really great. He said, this is our life on earth. And the rest of this rope, and he coiled it out, that's eternity. Of course, the rope wouldn't have an end. But for the sake of the illustration, of course, Scott couldn't find a rope that didn't end. But that's the point, that days of his flesh, that's that first inch. And it's the same way with us. We're in the days of our flesh. And that's just such a small portion of what's going on. And even as Jesus is suffering and all of that happened in the days of his flesh. And now you go look at Revelation chapter 4, you go look at the other parts of Revelation, you see that he's reigning as a king, that he's the honored one of heaven and all of that. And you see that the days of his flesh were really nothing compared to what comes after that. And so in a like manner, we're only in the days of our flesh, that little portion of our life. And I really, that illustration that Scott gave is really a great one, because it reminds us that though the days are evil, there's something to look forward to. So this is really talking about Jesus as he was a man. It says, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. What does that remind you of? Obviously, it reminds you of the Garden of Gethsemane, or it should. That's what it reminds me of. And remember, Bill had that nice little talk at the end of the sermon on Sunday, talking about being in the garden and how Jesus suffered in the garden and prayed and stuff. Let's turn to Luke chapter 22. And I think I have it on the board or on the script here. Oops, what happened? Chapter 22. And we'll look at Matthew 26 in a second. Luke chapter 22, verse 41 through 44. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, talking about the 3 disciples that he took to go pray with him. He withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven and strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And so the Luke here talks about, and Matthew's going to use a similar term, but Jesus was in agony. And this prayer, again, it says when he'd offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears. And that's exactly what the author here, Luke, is saying, and so does Matthew. Matthew chapter 26, it says, when Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and greatly distressed. And he said to them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And so we see the terms that Luke is using here, that he was in agony, that great sweat, or his sweat became like great drops of blood. I sweat when I'm outside working in the yard and stuff, but not like that. The idea, and that's with exertion, and that's exactly what he was doing when he was praying. He was exerting himself. Have you ever prayed like that? Have you ever prayed with such fervor that you started to sweat? That's what he was doing. Now, some people think that his stress was so great that it actually ruptured the capillaries in his face and real blood came down. It says it's like great drops of blood. If you ever cut yourself on the head, you bleed like terribly. And I think that's the idea, but it was sweat because he was exerting himself in prayer. And Matthew uses similar terms. He says he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And later on it says he fell on his face and prayed. I mean, he was so distressed that that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to fall on his face and prostrate himself to God and say, God, if you can take this away from me, please do. And it says in the next verse, it says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Though he was a son, God gave him an answer to his prayer. In fact, I think he answered his prayer in 2 ways. The first was, and we saw it in Luke 22:43, that God sent an angel to strengthen him. That was a big deal. It helped Jesus get through the rest of the night. It helped to get him through his trials. It helped him get him through I would imagine, his scourging, but the angel strengthened him. And the other answer to his prayer was what? There is no other way. You have to go through this. And so So it says that he was heard because of his godly fear. And we don't talk about that much, but the idea that Jesus had a godly fear of what? Of death, of what he was going to have to go through? Quite possibly. He was a man. He knew that it was going to hurt. And so, but God heard him. He heard his prayer. And like I said, he said, no, there's no other way. And so Jesus said, not my will, but your will. And he went through with it. But the point is that his prayer was answered. It was heard and answered. Even though it wasn't the answer that Jesus wanted to hear, it was answered nonetheless. So, Bill, hold on, I can unmute you myself. I think, yep, I did it. There you go, Bill.
Yeah, just asking a question about where he says here, yet he learned obedience by the things he suffered. And I mean, Jesus always obeyed the Father, right?
Yep.
Even before he was in the days of his flesh. But it seems like just a little bit of a different look at this is that really he had never been tempted before. And so not sure exactly how his
obedience. Well, no, I don't think, I think I have a slightly different take on that. So
okay.
Let me, but there's someone in the chat. So let me see if that's.
So yeah, my perspective there is that he learned obedience by the things he suffered, that perfection is the next point, and having been perfected.
Right.
So without really going through suffering, obedience is never total obedience really isn't perfected. If you understand, that's my.
I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to come to a similar conclusion, I think. So just hold your horses.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So the question says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things he suffered. We already looked at Philippians chapter 2, right? Which says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. We already looked at that. And I don't know if you think about this aspect of Jesus' personality. When you think about Jesus, you think about love and compassion and mercy, but you should also think about obedience. He was totally obedient to the Father. And there are many scriptures that talk about that. And I need to get my mouse back there. John 14:31, for instance, 14:31, for instance, that the world may know that I love the Father, and as the Father gave me commandments, so I do. Arise and let us go from here. Now that's just one little part of a paragraph, but the point is that God gave Jesus things to do, and he did them. Romans chapter 5, verse 19 says, talking about the difference between Adam and Jesus, it says, for by one man's disobedience, Adam, many were made sinners, but also by one man's obedience, many will be made righteous. We're made righteous by Jesus' obedience. And I think when we look at Isaiah 53 in just a little bit, that'll be made clear. Let me just check one thing real quick. I was just checking to see what time it is. I don't want to go over. We're doing pretty good. John chapter 5, verse 30. I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. In other words, he's not doing his own stuff. He's doing what God sent him to do. And Jesus said in John 4:34, after the disciples came to give him food after the woman at the well, Jesus said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and finish his work. Jesus was all about obedience. If you go and look at his life, not only was his life about love and about mercy and about compassion, it was about obedience. And so we need to keep that in mind in our own lives, because we're supposed to be like Christ. As it 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 says, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. So we need to make sure that we're doing that. So we have some verses here just to show that Jesus was obedient. And let me drop my page there. But let's look at Isaiah 53 for a minute. I don't have it on the board, so if you have your Bibles with you, turn over to it. But I want to read not the whole thing. I'm going to start in verse 3 and go through down about verse 10 and look at all the ways that it mentions that Jesus is going to suffer. In verse 3, it says, he is despised and rejected by men, Now, that's kind of a suffering there. People don't like you and reject you. He's a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Jesus was smitten by God and afflicted, it says. But he was wounded for our transgressions. That's another thing. Because we sin, he suffered the consequences of it. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Again, the Isaiah in his passage here is just laying it out, all the things that happened to Jesus. He doesn't say crucifixion here, but it mentions his stripes. I mean, Jesus was, as Bill Downey would say, the half-death. He was scourged. That could have killed him just by itself if God hadn't intended him to go to the cross. But it certainly didn't help him at all. But by his stripes we're healed. Verse 6 says, all we like sheep have gone astray and have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before his shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living, and for the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but the rich man is death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit nor was any deceit in his mouth. Verse 10 says, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him and put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, and it shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Verse 11 says, he, God, shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. Now that's a prophecy, of course, and we see that prophecy, and we see it fulfilled. We see it fulfilled in his scourging. We see it fulfilled in his treatment by the Sanhedrin and the guards, the palace guards, the praetorium. We see it we see it in his crucifixion, the suffering that he went through. But when it says yet he learned obedience, I don't think it means that he didn't know what obedience was. He knew what obedience was. But I think it's rather that it means that he tasted the depths of his obedience by his suffering. I think that's what you're trying to get at, Bill. That the suffering that he went through proved that he really was obedient, that he was the obedient child of God, the one that God looked at to save us from our sins. And so I believe that's what it means when he said he learned obedience. And this next idea, having been perfected, he became the author. Let me go back into having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Perfect means complete. Jesus completed his task as our Savior through his suffering. And I think it might also have something to do with what's said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if you go through that whole section. But we'll look at verse 42 through 44. So also is the resurrection from the dead. Of course, 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about Jesus being resurrected as the first fruits, and it talks about our heavenly bodies. But it says, so also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, which is what Jesus had. It is raised a spiritual body. That's the kind of perfection, the completeness that I think that we see here. Jesus in his obedience was perfected. He died and was raised again, and finished his task of salvation. So I think you've got two ideas there, that when it says that he has having been perfected, I think that means partly that he finished his job. And I think it also means partly that he's now a different man. He's got a different body, and that body is going to be that longer part of the rope, right? The part that's into salvation. So I've got just a couple verses here. Let's go through them quickly, and then we'll get to the next section next time. So in it says, author. It says that he's the author of eternal salvation. It could say captain here in some of your versions because it's the same exact word that's used in Hebrews chapter 10, or sorry, chapter 2, verse 10, where it says, "For it was fitting for him, for whom all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings." It's a totally related verse here. Jesus was made perfect through sufferings, but it's also he's the captain. He's the author. Those are the same word in the Greek. He's the author of eternal salvation. That means that he's the one that wrote it. Again, go to Revelation chapter 5 and see what Jesus does there. He's the one that made it all possible. That's what that means. And being the captain, of course, again, another way that word is translated means that he's the leader. He's the one that's carrying us through. Called by God as high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek. Again, the author is going to spend a lot of time after this as we go forward. But this is in keeping with the theme of the chapter, that Jesus was called by God because of what he did, because of his obedience. And he was called by God as high priest. And so we're going to see that. In, sorry if I get distracted because it pops up and shows me stuff on my screen. And I have to decide if someone's raising their hand or not. Sorry. We're going to see that as we go through, that Jesus was called to be high priest by God. And we'll see later that he's not called as a high priest like Aaron was, but he's called like Melchizedek was. And then the last verse here, I think is kind of sad. And it really saddens me, at least. It says, "Of whom we have much to say." Of whom points back to Melchizedek. It says, "Of whom we have much to say, and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing." And that's actually going to lead us into our next section. But it saddens me the author knows more about Melchizedek, or at least about what it means to be called high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. But we don't get to learn that. We don't get to understand that because the Hebrews were dull of hearing. And that's actually going to be our next warning. And we'll actually end here. But if you remember, there were some warnings that we talked about in the book of Hebrews. And why is that not updated? Oh, that's right. It was updated. I just didn't take away the underlining. Number 6, it's a bonus. Don't be dull of hearing. And that's what we're going to end the chapter with. It's a great little section that talks about that we should take warning of too, because it's going to be something that we could fall into ourselves. But this idea of being dull of hearing, again, we'll talk about that more next week. That's something we have to be careful with. These guys, if you think about what it's saying here, that they should be teachers by now, but instead they're not. It's because they've stopped learning, and they've stopped hearing. And because of that, there's a truth that the author wants to tell them that he can't tell them because they can't handle it. And so we need to be careful as Christians that we don't ever stop learning, that we don't ever stop trying, that we don't become dull of hearing, because there's going to be truths that we need to hear that we don't want to miss out on. So that's where I'm going to stop tonight. It's that's about the right length of our class here. So again, thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for, again, joining us on YouTube and joining in our experiment on Zoom for a class. I'm glad that some got to participate.